Anthony. So the reason why we added that value is what we call a transverse force is a force that's not an axial force. So an axial force would be, for example, pulling it in this direction or pushing it in. A transverse force would go in this direction or in this direction. And so what happened is we think that if you're pushing this in a transverse direction, the rod holder. By the way, this is an older version because I don't have right now with me that version that you currently have, which is the D variation. But let's use this for the illustrative purposes. But in the real use scenario, this is going to have some sort of transverse force pushing it in this direction. If the bushings that are inside do not lock this part in place, the button is actually could be misaligned from the different holes that we have across the proximal tube. So that's the main purpose of testing it with a transverse force, because if the bushing that slides inside of the proximal tube, wrapping around the back end of the middle tube, which is now the distal tube, that allows it to stay in position. If that bushing is not properly made, then there will be a little bit of a misalignment in this direction, which will make the button not align with one of these holes. So the button will have a little bit of an offset in this direction or in this direction. So let's say that the transverse force is here. That means we have a little bit of a pivot here. So it's going to move like this, right? We're pushing it like this, and that makes it pivot like this. And now the button is in this position instead of here. So it doesn't come out. It doesn't snap into the right position. That's something we're trying to avoid. I would say that the force to recommend here would be the force that the tent tends to generate when you assemble it. If that's something you can measure, that would be awesome. I don't know exactly how you would set it up to measure that properly, because there's other loads happening there. But I think that as long as it's, I would even say that's something that you can create with your hand, because we have to think about how this is going to be made. This is going to be made in an assembly setting. It's not like they're going to have one of these with them. Maybe a quality inspector, third party, inspector might actually be able to do that. But assuming we don't have a test chip for that, I would say that just apply force with your hand, and that should be an amount of force that is reasonable. And if you see that it doesn't slide into position, so for example, I have this one, let me press it so it okay, so I would apply force like this and then slide. So now this one is actually not snapping into position. So that means that, you see, after I release the force, it snapped. But in a real scenario, there might be a load applied to this, because you put it on a tent and the tent manages some loads. So I just noticed, for example, that hey, this one doesn't pass the test. I did some testing like manually when we were there, when I was in Las Vegas, and I was able to manipulate the prototype, and it actually passed that test that I did with my own hand. I would say something like, I don't know, how much force can I apply with my hand? Let me see. Something like 40 newtons. Yeah, something like 40 newtons or something like that. It varies a lot. Let's say, hey, if you're applying a force of 40 newtons in this direction and you push it to slide it into the next slot and it doesn't get in, pushing it, I'm sliding it. Okay, now it came in. Okay, so it passed. But I would say that it should work for all the different positions, not just for one. So maybe there's one position which is a worst case scenario, and maybe we can focus only on that one. And I would guess that that position is the most distal one, but not necessarily. So maybe for the time being we make them test each position. But yeah, that's what I meant. See, now I'm putting force and it's not snapping into position. But if I release and I move it, look, now it does. So that's something that would make life a lot harder for our users, and we don't want that to happen. So that's why I mentioned applying that load. Anyways, hope that clarifies it. Maybe you'll need to discuss this with Mark, and if you want to discuss it further with me, let me know, okay? I'll be available.